Some stories are so disturbing that even decades later people still struggle to believe they really happened. During World War II, while the world was focused on the battlefield, something else was happening behind closed doors. Hidden facilities, secret rooms, experiments carried out far from the public eye. For years, much of the truth remained buried, not because it was forgotten, but because many people never wanted to speak about it again. What happened inside those places would later shock the entire world. At the time, most people had no idea. The war itself was already terrifying enough. Entire cities were being destroyed. Millions of people were suffering. And in the middle of all that chaos, certain individuals began carrying out experiments that crossed every moral line imaginable. Officially, these locations were described as research facilities, but according to survivors, they were places filled with fear. Dark hallways, cold rooms, locked doors, places where people entered and sometimes never came back out again. Years later, when investigators began uncovering evidence, they found reports describing experiments involving extreme temperatures. Some individuals were reportedly exposed to freezing conditions for long periods of time, while researchers observed how long the human body could survive. Others were placed inside pressure chambers, simulating deadly altitudes. There were also reports of chemical testing, forced procedures, and painful operations performed without consent. According to testimonies, many victims were treated not as people, but as objects for experimentation. And perhaps the most disturbing part was how organized everything appeared to be. These were not isolated incidents. The experiments were documented, repeated, studied. There were records, schedules, detailed observations. Everything was carefully written down. As the war continued, the outside world remained largely unaware of what was happening behind those walls. The focus remained on the fighting, on survival, on the rapidly changing events across Europe. And because of that, many questions were ignored. For years, silence covered the truth. Documents disappeared. Some records were destroyed intentionally. Witnesses were often too afraid to speak. Others simply wanted to forget everything they had seen. But eventually, the silence began to break. When the war finally ended, investigators entered many of these facilities for the first time.
What they discovered was deeply disturbing. Rooms filled with equipment, medical records, experiment notes, photographs, evidence that revealed a horrifying reality. Survivors also began sharing their stories of fear, pain, isolation. Many described conditions that seemed impossible to imagine. And as more information became public, the world reacted with shock. People struggled to understand how something like this could happen without the outside world fully realizing it. Questions quickly followed. How long had this been happening? Who knew about it? And how many people were involved? Eventually, those responsible were brought before international courts. The trials exposed details that many people had never heard before. Investigators presented documents. Witnesses testified publicly. Survivors described what they endured. And little by little, we have to know the truth. The world had seen war before. But this felt different, because it revealed something darker, something hidden beneath the surface. The idea that scientific research, without morality, could become something terrifying. As a result, new international rules were eventually created. Medical ethics changed forever. Laws were introduced to protect human rights during scientific testing, and many of those rules still exist today. But despite everything that became public, some mysteries still remain. Not every document survived. Not every person involved was identified. And not every question was fully answered. Even now, decades later, historians continue studying the evidence, trying to understand how ordinary people could become involved in something so disturbing. And maybe that is the most unsettling part of all. Not just what happened, but how easily it happened. How secrecy, fear, and silence allowed these actions to continue for so long. Because history has shown that terrible things do not always happen in the open. Sometimes they happen quietly, hidden behind locked doors, hidden behind authority, hidden behind the excuse of research. And by the time the truth finally appears, the damage has already been done. Maybe that is why these stories continue to disturb people even today. Not because they are difficult to understand, but because they remind us how dangerous unchecked power can become, and how easily humanity can lose its moral boundaries when no one is willing to question what is happening behind the scenes. The most disturbing truths in history are often the ones hidden the deepest, and sometimes the world does not discover them